Hello and welcome to the Shifting Perspectives, Embracing Autism as a Unique Neurotype training. Today we will talk about neurodiversity and related terminology and symbolism, autism as a neurotype, causes of autism, the language we use when discussing autism, autism as a spectrum, understanding autistic traits using the Autism Spectrum Wheel, and finally, practical steps you can take towards using neurodiversity-affirming practices. So, what is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is the idea that differences in brain structure and function amongst humans is normal and natural. Human beings are a neurodiverse group. That is a fact of life. We all have different brains that function differently and impact our behavior. The word we use to describe different types of brain wiring is neurotype. The type of brain wiring that is believed to be the most common is referred to as neurotypical. Any other type of brain wiring is called neurodivergent. There is no right way for the brain to work. No two brains function just alike. Brain differences lead to varying social preferences, ways of learning, communicating, and perceiving the environment. Because of this, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of neurotypical people may seem expected, while the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of neurodivergent individuals may seem unexpected. So, what is autism? Autism is a unique way that some people's brains are wired. So, it's a neurotype, which is neurodivergent or different from that of most people. This type of brain wiring tends to result in a specific set of traits, including intense emotions, environmental sensitivities, and differences in communication. What causes autism? Well, the causes of autism are complex and not fully understood, but research suggests that a combination of factors related to genetics, the environment, including prenatal exposures, and brain development factors may be at play. Regarding genetics, gene changes passed from parent to child may increase the likelihood of autism. Autism tends to run in families. Expression of autistic traits also depends on the environment the individual is in. Autism also results from differences in brain development, making it a brain-based disability. In neurotypical people, the brain goes through a process known as pruning, which is the reduction of connections to help filter out irrelevant sensory input. This is illustrated on the top right of the screen. You can see the brain on the left has more connections, and after going through a process of pruning, the brain has less connections. With autism, however, this process does not happen as much, leaving the brain with more connections. This is illustrated on the bottom right of the screen. On the left, in the brain of a typically developing child, you can see there are fewer connections compared to the brain on the right of an autistic child, which has many more connections. This means that autistic people are processing more information compared to neurotypical people, and that is why they might need extra time, support, and reassurance along the way. The language we use when talking to or about an autistic person is important. There are two main types of language you can choose from: person-first and identity-first language. Person-first language emphasizes the person before the disability. Examples of this language are person with autism or Lola has autism. Identity-first language acknowledges the disability as a core aspect of the person. Examples of identity-first language are saying autistic person or Lola is autistic. So, which language should you use? Well, many autistic self-advocates have expressed a preference for identity-first language. This is because phrases such as on the spectrum or person with autism imply that autism is an accessory which they can get rid of or put down, whereas autistic person makes it clear that autism is inherent and central to who they are and that they cannot and should not get rid of their autism. Like with all things, it is important to ask each individual what their preferred language is. The symbols you use to represent autism are also important. There are many that are currently being used, but the most common ones are the puzzle piece and the infinity symbol. The puzzle piece was created in 1963 and was long recognized as the symbol for autism. Originally, it represented that children with autism live challenging and puzzling lives. Multiple iterations of the puzzle piece have been made since, without the child crying and in different colors. But it is still often criticized for being patronizing and is thought to imply that autistic people need to be solved, don't fit in, or are incomplete. There has been a shift towards different symbols that seek to present a more positive and inclusive representation of autism. The rainbow infinity symbol represents neurodiversity. This is the concept that differences in brain structure and function amongst humans is normal, and that there is no right way for the brain to work. This aims to foster inclusivity and acceptance for multiple neurodivergent communities, including autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. The gold infinity symbol is meant specifically to represent and foster inclusivity and acceptance of autistic people. You might have heard that autism is a spectrum, but what does this mean? Well, each autistic person is different, and the word spectrum means that autism consists of a wide range of traits that occur in different combinations and intensities between individuals. And get this, the spectrum is not linear. A person cannot be more or less autistic, and saying so can lead to negative assumptions. For example, if someone is described as more autistic because they are non-speaking, they may be denied access to learning topics that they would be able to understand at school. On the other hand, if someone is described as less autistic because they have learned to hide their autistic traits, they may feel misunderstood and may be denied access to supports that they need. Neither of these people are more or less autistic. They are simply different. So, think of the spectrum like a wheel or a pie chart. Each wedge represents a different trait, and the more colored in the trait is, the stronger the trait is for that person. For some people, many traits will be colored in, while for others, few will be colored. Autism is also dynamic. This means that the traits a person possesses can change over time and across environments, which is represented by differences in wedge labels and shading. This means that some days an autistic person may be able to manage their daily schedule independently, while on other days they may need a lot of help. It also means that they may be able to manage tasks in one environment, like at home, but not in others, like at school. This doesn't mean that they are more autistic some days and less autistic other days. They are simply dynamic individuals with fluctuating strengths and needs. Here's an example of what the Autism Spectrum Wheel might look like. This image has been adapted from Matt Lowry's model of the autism spectrum. Matt Lowry is a licensed psychology practitioner and an autistic adult. These are the traits that we will focus on today. Special interests, or SPINs for short, are topics, objects, activities, or hobbies that an autistic person really enjoys and focuses a lot of their time on. They may be related to just about anything, including trains, animals, computers, museums, artists, or TV shows. SPINs may change quickly or last a very long time, and they are super important to autistic folks because they help them feel like themselves and develop a sense of self-concept. They make it easier to feel good and focus. They keep them from feeling sad or down, and they can even lead to making friends or finding a new job. Self-stimulatory behaviors, or STIMs for short, are repetitive thoughts or actions that help an autistic person express their feelings or communicate without words, calm down when they're feeling anxious, stressed, or overwhelmed, enjoy themselves and have fun, or feel good and focus. Different stims include looking at things or watching things move, making noises or saying or thinking the same words over and over, moving the body in a repetitive way, like when rocking or posturing their hands, tasting, smelling, or touching things repeatedly, or chewing on objects and grinding teeth. If a stim is not safe, we can find other things that serve the same purpose. Sensory processing differences are another trait on the Autism Spectrum Wheel. Our bodies have 5 senses that help us experience the world around us, including sight, taste, smell, touch, and hearing. We also have 3 inner senses that help us with movement, body position, and understanding our emotions and body states like hunger and thirst. Sensory processing involves how the brain takes in information from these senses and figures out how to respond to it. Sensory processing is necessary for completing everyday tasks and routines, maintaining our energy level, and focusing. And sensory processing is involved in everything we do. For example, if a client needs to put on their jacket to go out for a walk, they first need to be able to hear the instructor tell them that it is time to leave. Then they need to visually notice their jacket and coordinate their body to move towards it. Finally, they need to use their sense of vision, touch, and body to put their arms into the sleeves, pinch the zipper, and pull it up. Everything we do relies on sensory processing. So now that you know that autistic people often process sensory information differently, how do you begin to understand their differences and their needs? Well, autistic people often need more or less sensory input than neurotypical people to function. How we decide whether a person needs more or less input is based on their sensory profile. A sensory profile describes how a person is likely to respond to the things they see, hear, and feel every day. And sensory profiles are determined based on 2 things. First, how much input the person needs, which is represented on the vertical axis. On the top would be an individual who requires a lot of input, and on the bottom, an individual who requires very little input. This is referred to as their neurological threshold. The second is whether the person does things or not to increase or decrease their input as needed. So what is their self-regulation strategy? On the left, you can see passive self-regulation strategies, such as attempting to tolerate the input. And on the right, you can see active self-regulation strategies, such as doing something to avoid the input. Sensory profiles are not static. They can change across days or environments and can even be different between the senses. This means that a person may require a lot of sound input, but very little visual input. It also means that a child may be sensitive to visual input in the classroom, and they may get distracted by posters and visual clutter. But at home, they have a high threshold for visual input, and they may not notice things while they're cleaning up, leaving extra mess at home. There are 4 sensory profiles to help you understand different sensory needs. The first is low registration on the top left of the quadrant. People with a low registration profile have high thresholds for input, so they need a lot of the same. But they use passive self-regulation strategies, so they do not actively try to increase their input. And because of this, they may appear low energy and may miss things in their environment. The next profile is sensory seeking. People with a sensory seeking profile also need a lot of sensory input, but they use active self-regulation strategies, so they do things to increase their input. These people may appear active or impulsive. The third kind of sensory profile is sensory sensitivity on the bottom left of the image. People with a sensory sensitive profile have low thresholds for sensory input, meaning they need very little of it. and they use passive self-regulation strategies. So they do not try to lessen their inputs, and they may just try to tolerate them. These people may appear distracted, irritable, or uncomfortable. The final sensory profile is sensory avoiding on the bottom right of the quadrant. These people also have a low threshold for input and need very little of it. They use active self-regulation strategies, so they do things to decrease their input. So these people may remove their clothes, refuse school, or cover their ears in a noisy environment. Let's go through a made-up case scenario to help us understand sensory processing differences. Khalid, a 7-year-old boy, attends a mainstream primary school classroom. His teacher says he often slumps in his chair, half folded over his desk, with his head rested on his arm while she teaches. She describes him as lazy and says he often stares into the distance, looking sleepy, and does not respond. Regarding his attire, his pants are twisted, and his shirt is often covered with food droppings after lunchtime. His parents say his siblings love to run and play at home, but he spends most of his time lying on the sofa. They give him extra sleep because he looks tired, but he's always the same, no matter how much sleep he gets. Sometimes he seems to wake up and respond and participate, but it only ever lasts a few minutes. So, what is Khaled's sensory profile? There are a couple of questions you can ask yourself when you're trying to figure out what someone's sensory profile might be. The first is the person struggling because they are noticing everything, meaning they have a low threshold? Or are they struggling because they appear to miss things, meaning they have a high threshold? The second thing to ask yourself is the person doing things to increase or decrease their input or not? These two questions will help you place someone along the quadrants. Let's look back to the case study to review your answer. Khaled's teacher said he does not respond to her and that he doesn't seem to notice when his pants are twisted and his shirt is covered in food. He is struggling because he's missing things, so he likely has a high threshold for sensory input, placing him on the top of the image. His teachers and parents also said he's lazy, sleepy, and spends most of his time slouching at his desk or on the sofa. This can indicate that he's not doing anything actively to increase his sensory input, meaning he has passive self-regulation strategies. This places him on the top left of the quadrant, meaning he has a low registration sensory profile. Does Khaled require increased or decreased sensory input to support his attention and focus? When considering whether a person needs more or less sensory input, you can ask yourself, is their threshold for noticing high or low? Let's look back to the case study to review your answer. Khaled had a low registration sensory profile, which means he has a high threshold for noticing sensory input. People who have a high threshold for noticing need a lot of sensory input to support their attention and focus. Strategies you can use to increase someone's sensory input might involve enhancing task features and contextual cues to increase the chance they will notice what is going on. For example, you may increase contrast using colored mats under materials such as a plate and food to make it more noticeable. You may decrease the predictability of routines to keep things new and stimulating. You may keep items that are commonly used grouped in colored, labeled bins, drawers, or cabinets to draw attention. Or you may add texture to things like cushions, desk strips, or utensils to draw their attention while doing things like eating and working. Without knowing his sensory profile, what assumptions were made about Khaled by his caregivers at home and at school? What impact might these assumptions have had on him? Let's review potential answers. The first assumption that was made is that Khaled is tired. To remediate this, his caregivers encouraged more sleep, which left the underlying issue unaddressed. Too much sleep might have also increased his daytime sleepiness, further reducing the likelihood that he will notice and interact with the things going on in his environment. A second assumption that was made in the case study was that Khaled is lazy. His caregivers relied on behavioral strategies like punishment and reinforcement to encourage and motivate him. But again, this left the underlying issue unaddressed and did not support him effectively to participate in his environment. Ineffective use of strategies might have caused him to develop poor self-esteem, as he might have thought he was deficient and that is why the strategies were not working. This may further decrease the likelihood that he will try to interact with his surroundings in the future. Emotional processing differences is the next trait on the Autism Spectrum Wheel. The amygdala, which is a key emotional processing center in the brain, often has extra connections in autism. For autistic people, this can mean they have strong emotions which override their logical thinking. They may experience alexithymia, which is difficulty recognizing or describing their feelings. They may experience emotional overload, causing meltdowns or shutdowns. They may have situational mutism, which involves not speaking in certain situations due to overwhelm. They may be extremely sensitive to situations around justice and injustice. And they may also experience intense moments of happiness, which is known as autistic euphoria. Autistic people may also have differences in executive functioning skills. Executive functions are the brain's toolkit for getting things done. They include skills like setting goals, organizing, planning, prioritizing, following steps, knowing when to start and stop, and keeping track of how things are going. But why do autistic people sometimes struggle with these executive functions? Well, we know that autistic people process more information, focus on details, and collect a lot of information before making decisions. Because of this, they might have a strong need to know what's going to happen. They're already processing extra information, so knowing what's going to happen can make it easier for them to manage tasks and routines. This is known as expectation sensitivity. They may ask repetitive questions to feel more certain about something, which is known as polling. They may struggle to do things like set goals and plan and prioritize because they think about all the small steps involved in a process instead of thinking about the big picture. This is known as process complexity. And an example is, instead of thinking, I need to clean the bathroom, they might think, I need to sweep the floor, empty the garbage, clean the toilet, wash the shower, and wipe the mirror, and refill the soap. This can quickly become overwhelming and make skills like planning and prioritizing difficult. Finally, they may struggle with starting or stopping tasks or changing plans because of something called autistic inertia. Understanding that these executive functioning skills can be challenging for autistic people shows you that they're not being difficult, they are struggling, and that they may need assistance and accommodations to plan and work through their thinking processes. The next trait on the Autism Spectrum Wheel is gross and fine motor skill differences. Autistic people tend to develop at their own pace, which can be different from that of neurotypical people. They might have differences in how they move their bodies, like with strength, balance, and coordination, which can make it harder to do things like sports or tasks that need big coordinated movements like dressing. They may also struggle with small movements, like using their fingers to write neatly or do up buttons, because they might find it hard to coordinate their hands and their eyes. The second last trait on the autism wheel is communication differences. Autistic communication is often different to neurotypical communication, but it is natural and comfortable for autistic people. For instance, autistic speech might be flat in tone, monotone, jumpy or switching between topics quickly, disjointed, formal or overly precise, pedantic, not following a straight line of thought, nonlinear, or without pauses for regular breath. In addition to differences in speech quality, autistic people may have unique ways of communicating. For example, they may use familiar phrases over and over again, like saying, Happy Monday, every Monday. This is known as a script and sounds the exact same every time a person uses it. They may repeat quotes or phrases that they've heard to express themselves or ask for things instead of making up new sentences. This is known as echolalia. They may mimic accents or speech patterns, which is known as palilalia. They may use memes, song lyrics, or other references they feel are relatable in an attempt to express themselves in a comfortable manner. They may talk for a long time about topics they're interested in without pausing for others to join in. This is known as monologuing or info dumping and is often done in an attempt to connect with others. The final trait on the autism spectrum wheel is relationship differences. Autistic individuals might avoid or hold very intense eye contact, prefer meaningful conversations instead of small talk, give very honest answers to everyday questions, enjoy being around others without always interacting with them, need breaks from others because it is overwhelming, need to be around others to help them focus on tasks, which is known as body doubling, or feel deeply connected to fictional characters, using stories to express their feelings and navigate situations. Some other relationship phenomena that autistic people may experience because of strong emotions, sensory sensitivity, and past relationship experiences include rejection-sensitive dysphoria. This is an extreme physical or emotional reaction to real or perceived rejection or criticism. This can lead to a desire to be alone, a desire to hide or mask their autistic traits to fit in, which can lead to burnout, and a need for frequent reassurance in relationships. Having awareness of rejection-sensitive dysphoria, support personnel should be mindful of their facial expressions, body language, and tone around autistic individuals. They should offer reassurance as needed. They may also use their body language and facial expressions to express, "I accept you and I am comfortable" when presented with communication differences. They may do things such as connect on special interests as a bid for connection. Additionally, it's important to note that autistic people are at a higher risk of abuse in relationships because they've been taught to prioritize others' needs over their own. With this information, support personnel should avoid arbitrarily enforcing compliance. So, now that you know that autism is a neurotype or a natural variance in human brain structure and function that cannot and should not be gotten rid of, how can you best support your autistic clientele? Well, you can make sure you are following the next 3 steps towards using strengths and rights-based neurodiversity-affirming practices. First, you must understand the double empathy problem and must share the responsibility for change. Historically, there's been a focus on teaching autistic people how to fit into the neurotypical world because the assumption was that neurotypical ways are better. But the double empathy problem shows that both neurotypical and autistic people feel comfortable when interacting with others of the same neurotype. But when they interact with someone of a different neurotype, they're not as happy. This means that communication challenges between autistic and neurotypical people are a two-way street. They're caused by both groups' difficulties in understanding each other, not because autistic people are deficient in empathy or social skills. Autistic people simply have their own ways of interacting that are just as important and valid as neurotypical ways. Traits of autism, like differences in social communication, aren't deficits, they're just differences. So, if autism is a valid and equal way of being, with its own culture, norms, and skills, both autistic and neurotypical individuals need to adjust and create better environments for interactions between different neurotypes. It shouldn't all fall on autistic people to make neurotypical people more comfortable. It should also fall on neurotypical people to do the same. In your day-to-day, this might look like taking time to learn about and embrace autistic differences, not prompting a client to use their words or make eye contact because you know they might communicate differently and prefer to not make eye contact. It might mean giving an autistic person an item related to or sharing info related to their special interest to connect with them. It might be allowing an autistic person to ask deep questions, but encouraging them to let the listener know that they don't have to respond if they don't want to, instead of forcing them to do small talk. It might mean allowing the person to stim and using your body language and facial expression to convey that you are not, in fact, uncomfortable. The second thing you can do is question yourself and your practices to see if they are neurodiversity affirming. Neurodiversity affirming practices prioritize strengths, rights, supports, and adaptations that affirm the neurodivergent identity, not hide it. Start by believing in the person's abilities and assuming their competence. Avoid talking about them as if they're not there. Always speak directly to them with respect and understanding. You can see the tenets of neurodiversity affirming practices on the right of the screen. They include respecting autistic communication and relationship styles. Strategies should be informed by neurodivergent voices. Strategies should presume competence. They should be strengths-based and individualized. They should honor neurodivergent culture, and they should respect and promote autonomy. This list of questions has been adapted from Dalman et al. Please keep it aside and use it to question yourself to see if your communication and support strategies are neurodiversity affirming. The questions include, am I respecting how autistic individuals communicate and build relationships? Am I promoting acceptance of autistic behaviors rather than trying to change them? Am I acknowledging and respecting the uniqueness and complexity of the autistic behavior? What would the autistic community think of this? Is this choice informed by autistic voices? Am I prioritizing positive engagement and emotional well-being over compliance? Am I respecting physical autonomy, ensuring consent before physical contact? The final step you can take towards using neurodiversity affirming practices is to create a culture of calm. Autistic people are often experiencing heightened fear and chronic stress because of their sensory and emotional processing differences and past experiences of trauma in personal and therapeutic relationships. This drains their cognitive resources, which means they don't have the mental energy or capacity to focus, think, and problem solve regarding other things. To support them effectively, it's crucial for neurotypical people to prioritize creating a calm environment. This will help autistic people move from their survival mode to a state where they can better access their skills and abilities to participate in routines and tasks. Here are 4 practical steps you can take towards creating a culture of calm. First, create an organized environment. Reduce clutter and keep items in consistent locations. Use closed shelving for storage and create a calm down area. Next, recognize your own stress. You too are part of the environment. Be mindful of your emotions and name them to avoid attributing them to others. For example, you could say, I'm feeling a bit off today, but it's not because of anyone here. Next, achieve genuine calmness. Practice relaxation techniques like deep breathing, gentle movements, or grounding, which involves focusing on the things you see, feel, and hear to move your focus from your mind to the here and now. Demonstrate as you practice these strategies to model calmness and spread calmness. Finally, foster connection and reassurance. If someone is struggling, offer supportive words such as I'm here for you or it's okay. Others might prefer a gentle touch on their shoulder or simply being nearby them in physical proximity with an open, non-confrontational body posture to show your support. The words, gestures, or actions that will make each autistic person feel safe and supported will be different, so it's important to use preferred strategies. That brings us to the end of today's Shifting Perspectives, Understanding Autism as a Unique Neurotype training. Congratulations, and once again, welcome to the SAC Autism Center.